If I was to ask you who your favourite Scottish writer was, who would you say? I would guess you would maybe say Rabbie Burns, Walter Scott, maybe Muriel Spark or Irvine Welsh. If I was to ask you who your favourite Scottish artist was, I would maybe guess you would say Charles Jenny Mackintosh. If you were to ask me both these questions, you would get the same answer: Alasdair Gray. If you aren't familiar with Alasdair Gray, he was one of Scotland's greatest ever writers and artists. He was a mind unlike any that had came before him. He left behind a lifetime of groundbreaking literature, beautiful and weird art, poetry, plays, public murals and intimate portraits. One of Alasdair Gray's greatest works, his novel Poor Things, is soon to be released as a film by Yorgos Lanthimos, the acclaimed director of The Lobster and The Favourite. His version of Poor Things just won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, so he is without a doubt one of the most exciting directors working today. Like everything Alasdair Gray did, Poor Things is a uniquely Glaswegian and Scottish piece of work. But here's the problem with the film. It wasn't filmed in Glasgow or Scotland at all, and not a single member of the main cast is Scottish. Alasdair Gray died in 2019, but his work still illuminates Glasgow and Scotland. We no longer have the privilege of living with this creative force of nature, but we do have his legacy. Over the last few months, I've been speaking to some of those who know Alasdair's work best, and I've found myself asking some questions. Do us Scots value our artists and writers enough? How can we even begin to understand Alasdair Gray's legacy? And who was the man, really?
There's this feeling you have that even a false picture of you is more interesting than no picture at all. But I would like to begin by telling you about the falseness of this picture, because though some parts of it will be less false than others, the whole of it will be, well, very false indeed.
Behind me is where it all started for the young Alasdair Gray. It was here that Alasdair read everything he could get his hands on, taking in everything he could about the worlds of art and literature.
I grew up, like most people in Britain, thinking that we were thoroughly middle class. My father, since the 1418 war, where he fought, had worked in, in Laird's. It was on a machine that cut cardboard boxes in Bridgeton, and therefore he was employed right through the dismal 30s, and we were among the first families to be in Ridley, which was a good red sandstone corporation housing scheme, unlike Black Hill, which was over the canal, which was grey sandstone, and Catholics lived there, and therefore, of course, we felt upper class.
Alasdair's overbearing creativity romanticised and redefined Ridley for himself, just as he later did for Glasgow for everyone else. He used his childhood experiences growing up here in what is probably his greatest literary work, Lanark. I won't even try and describe that to you. I'll leave that to the man himself.
What do you say to them?
I say it is a Scottish petty bourgeois model of the universe.
Just like that?
Yes, I've rehearsed it and honed it down to as few words as possible. Glasgow's a magnificent city, said MacAlpin. Why do we hardly ever notice that? Because nobody imagines living here, said Thaw. MacAlpin lit a cigarette and said, if you want to explain that, I'll certainly listen. Then think of Florence, Paris, London, New York. Nobody visiting them for the first time is a stranger, because he's already visited them in paintings, novels, history books and films. But if a city hasn't been used by an artist, not even the inhabitants live there imaginatively. What is Glasgow to most of us? A house, the place we work, a football park or golf course, some pubs and connecting streets, that's all. No, I'm wrong. There's also the cinema and library, and when our imagination needs exercise, we use these to visit London, Paris, Rome under the Caesars, the American West at the turn of the century, anywhere but here and now. Imaginatively, Glasgow exists as a music hall, song, and a few bad novels. That's all we've given to the world outside. It's all we've given to ourselves.
That was probably the most well-known bit of Lanark, but thanks to Alasdair, it's not really true anymore. It's almost like he taught Glasgow to love itself. I'm on my way to the Alasdair Gray Archive. Under the custodianship of Sorcha Dallas, they're probably more responsible than anyone else for protecting Alasdair Gray's legacy, and now they're set on expanding it. There's something really special about visiting the archive. It's not like other archives dedicated to great artists and writers. It's not a cold museum exhibition. Instead, it feels like stepping into Alasdair's home.
This is one of the objects that came from Alasdair's flat, the home that he lived in just off Byres Road and Marchmont Terrace. And this is one of the objects that was in his home, which is quite important. It's his green chair. He used to sit in it when he was working. So did many of his assistants, secretaries, editors, friends and family. And it's included in many of the portraits he drew of those people over the years too. And in fact, it stands in for a throne within one of his murals within the Greenbank Church of Scotland too. Last year we commissioned the poet and writer Michael Pedersen, who we asked to come in and creatively respond to something within the archive, and he decided to pen almost like a love letter to the green chair, which you can read. He almost gave voice to this green chair, and in fact he said if you sat on this chair and looked out on the objects within the archive, it was maybe the closest place you could get to almost feeling like what it might be to be Alasdair Gray sitting within this environment and with all these objects that surrounded him. The mission is to raise public awareness really of the life and work of Alasdair Gray, to create opportunities for others to creatively, and not just creatively, but to explore the legacy that he's left, and to make it a generative resource for the future. So it's really important that it's not historic and fixed, that it's constantly being added to and it's growing. And there's a number of different ways in which we do that. One is obviously allowing public access and running public events, not just within the archive, but with partners externally. Another cornerstone really to it is education. Alasdair believed in the transformative power of education and creativity, and we believe in that too. So it's about creating opportunities for people to come in and learn and contribute and extend the knowledge around the archive. And that's not just at undergrad and postgrad level, it's at primary schools, at secondary schools and beyond as well. And then another key part of it is to make it a generative resource now and for the future. You know, Alasdair was always interested in, his whole work is creatively responding to things in a way that existed already. You know, to Poor Things as a case in point, isn't it? A reworking of Frankenstein, but written into Victorian Glasgow. So we want to create opportunities for other creatives to explore his legacy in a similar way, to add to it and to extend it and to make it something that is always growing and evolving too. This year we worked with the writer and journalist Chicha Ramaswamy, and one of the things that she found particularly sort of moving for her was Alasdair's tin of prunes that he kept his pens in, and I think it's because that really resonated with her on a personal level. She lost her mum during COVID. Her mum used to have prunes and tins just like that she kept her pens in. So I think you can almost predict sometimes what people are going to respond to. And of course, there's the artworks, there's the font, there's the publications, there's the murals, but there's beyond of that, there's a life that's lived, and a life I think that was lived really well, that was lived with really kind of ethics and principles at the core of it. I remember the first time I met Alasdair, and I was probably a bit like you, maybe if you were about to meet him too, if you've liked and admired his work. I was really nervous about first meeting him. I'd written a letter to him. I was running a commercial gallery at the time, and I was really keen. I knew no one was really taking care of his visual work, so I was really keen to think about supporting that side of it. I wrote him a letter. I got a beautifully written letter back saying, please come at this certain time to my house. So went up one evening, and I remember walking up the hill to his flat on Marchmont Terrace and being really, really nervous and not my stomach getting larger and larger. And then I met him, and he was there in his pajamas with his slippers on, and he did his very kind of customary hello and come on in, and walked over the threshold of that living room, which part of it is obviously recreated here at the archive. And it really just took my breath away, just what it was a space that was just loaded with artworks, loads of his artworks in various states of completion, books, ephemera, artefacts, works in progress. It was just rich. It was so rich and full of life and creativity, and he was just so generous.
Lauren Forde is a PhD student working with Alasdair Gray Archive. Her research concerns the way that Alasdair documented the disappearing parts of Glasgow through his work.
So Alasdair Gray throughout his life always documented people and places within the city of Glasgow, and he sort of used people again in different pieces of work, whether it be like his visual work or literary. And he had certain emblems of places around Glasgow that he also repeated. So in a way, throughout his life, he was documenting and preserving the city of Glasgow.
The archive is maybe different from other archives in the fact that it's recreating Alasdair Gray's living room and all the objects and materials that were surrounding him, and that really helps to reflect who he was as a person and a practitioner. And one thing that he was really interested in doing was recycling. That was prompted by economics and the fact that he was almost permanently skint. And this is a great example of that. This is an old ledger that you can see. It's quite battered and worn. He found it in a skip up near the art school where he was living and working at the time. So we can see on the first page the original entries from the accountancy firm who were annotating it in the 1957. Alasdair took it into his home in 1963, and he starts to use it. You can see his own very distinct cursive writing. He starts to create sort of diary entries. He starts to draw friends and family. This is a neighbour who lived close to him. But he's also starting to use it to map and record the city around him for two of his most well-known works, for the artworks Cowcaddens and also for the book he was working on at the time, Lanark. So you can see him mapping and recording the city using photography, but also using sketches and studies too. And many of the sketches and studies that are contained within this ledger also directly reference the landscape outside of where we're based here at the Whisky Bond by Applecross and the Firth and Clyde Canal.
Monkland Canal was the kind of genesis of Cowcaddon Streetscape that he started during his third year at art school and then sort of left it for a while. But the Monkland Canal is kind of an important part of Glasgow's history. Alasdair Gray always had a kind of fascination and awe of the Monkland Canal from a young age because it used to go through Ridley. He says this canal proved that people had once done gigantic things here, so might do them again. A wonderful idea, which I think is just a nice way that sort of a young boy can kind of see this canal and old architecture and just be so fascinated by it and think the kind of potential of Glasgow, like back then and also for the future. Alasdair Gray used the Monkland Canal in another painting in 1953. There was this painting called Musicians, and it's his sister in a piano lesson, and they're in a tenement and there's windows at the back. He's painted a portion of the Monkland Canal into the view out the window, and he says himself that like the Monkland Canal was nowhere near it, you know, so that's kind of his way of preserving the Monkland Canal within his art, even though it's just like a piano lesson with his sister. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to shove the Monkland Canal in there. So he came back to Cowcaddon Streetscape in the 1960s. He started it, I think, again in 1963, and then it obviously like evolved and grew into a panoramic shot of Cowcaddens, and it's a 160-degree angle of Cowcaddens, which was quite a modern technique at the time, and it allowed him to capture a large portion of the area.
I interviewed my next guest in the West End, and if you leave the archive to get the subway from Cowcaddens to Hill Head, you'll pass Alasdair's Hill Head subway mural. It's an example of how Alasdair's work helps you reflect on your experience of the city. For example, on the mural is Cecil Street, where my mum and dad used to live. The Hill Head subway mural depicts the Òran Moor, one of Glasgow's best pubs and music venues. It even has its own wee Sistine chapel. Its ceiling was painted by Alasdair and may be Alasdair's visual masterpiece. Rodge Glass is an author, and very few people could claim to know Alasdair and his work better. Between 2002 and 2005, Rodge was Alasdair's personal assistant, and he used that experience to write the definitive biography of Alasdair's life.
In many ways, my favourite piece of visual art is here, but it's also rooted in other murals that no longer exist, because for decades, nearly all of Alasdair's works, which he chose to put in free to access spaces within his own city. And he knew those were vulnerable, but they were often knocked down or ignored or painted over. So he was often recycling them in new contexts. And although there are lots of elements of the Òran Mór auditorium that are fresh to this particular work, there are also motifs, emblems, figures that are recreations of lost murals, which is part of the reason why I love the Òran Mór auditorium so much, because I feel like it's a container for all of Alasdair's previous murals, as well as being this one. And I worked for him as his secretary for about 4 years before I started writing his biography. And he would sit there, drinking cold soup from the can so he wouldn't have to get up and leave the computer so he could utterly focus. And that was my writer's education, seeing how writers worked. So I don't ever say that I feel like I saw something unique or something different to anybody else. I feel like I just got to see a lot of it, of the way that he was. He didn't have a particular filter where he would modify his behavior in different situations. He would just dominate a space. He had this huge intelligence, but was very humble, and a mixture of sort of this outlandish, loud, almost overconfidence, and then contrast that with this very quiet side where he was incredibly focused on whatever he was making. And in the time that I worked with him, he would sometimes be moving between rooms. He'd have me at the computer with whatever he was writing, and he might have visual artist assistants in the other room as well. So I was always conscious of just being part of quite a long tradition, actually, of people who got access to seeing him in his working environment, because his work environment was his home environment. We worked in his bedroom, and he was surrounded by his work. So you did feel like you were getting the man as he really was, because that was so unusual. And I was convinced that in Scotland in particular, people would want to know what it was like to be in a room with Alasdair Gray in 100 years. That's why I wanted to do the biography, and to do it in the way that I did it, which was a series of portraits, looking at him, concentrating on him, backgrounding me, and then mixing that in with an analysis of the life and the work. I never quite got over the fact that I was a huge fan that didn't know him, and then somebody that would see him very regularly. But bit by bit, you do get to a point where you stop thinking about how others perceive the person that you're standing with. And particularly because Alasdair was often ill and I was often worried about his health, that would sometimes take over. Or, if part of my role was to be caring in some way or to be looking out for him or looking after him, there's not really much time to be doing that and also be thinking, oh wow, I'm in a room with Alasdair Gray. Although, occasionally something would happen and you think this is a moment that I'm going to remember, or I would think what incredible luck this is. That's often how I felt, actually. I felt like I'd lucked out, because Alasdair had always had secretaries, because he never typed. He always said he assumed a computer was a much more complicated version of a typewriter, and he never learned to use one of those. So in a way, it was like walking into his flat. Suddenly you're in the 19th century. He was pacing up and down in front of you, and you're sitting there like that, waiting for the magic to come out. And there were moments where I felt incredibly lucky to be seeing how he worked at close quarters. Not least because that was my own writer's education, but also just the privilege of being in that space, being able to see Alasdair Gray make up new things. That was really wonderful.
If you're familiar with Glasgow's West End, you'll know that just round from the Òran Mór is the Ubiquitous Chip, a restaurant and pub at one end of Ashton Lane. Alasdair painted its murals in return for food, and they depict some people that have worked there over the years and characters of West End life. It was here that I met my final guest, Alan Bisset. Alan is an author and a playwright, and he worked with Alasdair professionally and held him in very high regard.
It's like, well, the very first time I ever met him, I was a student still in university, and he was doing a talk at the university during the day, and at night he was doing a talk for Stirling Writers Group. I was at both. I was in Stirling Writers Group and I was at the uni, so I sort of took it upon myself to be chaperone around Stirling that day. So after he'd done his talk at the uni, I was like, well, let's go to the pub, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. Like, I can sit with the man himself and like pick his brains and like, Alasdair, tell me how you wrote Lanark, this kind of stuff. And after a while, I was just getting the feeling he was a bit bored. You know, and he would rather have been doing his own thing. But he realised he still had like a couple of hours to go before the talk still in writer's group. So he reached for the local newspaper and opened it, and he was like, oh, there's a film on it, the picture's starting in 5 minutes. Why don't we go to that? And I'm like, all right, aye, sure. And we went to the pictures, and it was a film called Bedazzled. Some Liz Hurley and Brendan Fraser comedy, and a remake of Dudley Moore and Peter Cook one. It's garbage. But we were the only two people in the cinema, and we're sitting with a big tub of popcorn. And Alasdair was pissing himself laughing. You know, he's just going, oh, and at one point he went like, oh, and the popcorn went flying everywhere. And I remember thinking, this is really surreal. Of all the things I thought I was going to be doing with Alasdair Gray, watching this movie in a cinema on our own isn't one of them. And then we had to leave because I was like, Alasdair, we have to get to the venue now, like it's going to be starting in 15 minutes. But the film's not finished. So he was a bit annoyed that I tried to pull him away before he got to see the end of the movie. And about 10 years later, I met him again in Borders bookstore. He was doing an event there, and I went up afterwards and said, oh, Alasdair, you might not remember me. And he went, I never got to see the end of that film. This is the thing that had stood out, you know, like 10 years later. So I really wish at some point he'd got to see the end of that movie. Well, he was just a very generous man. You know, you hear all sorts of stories about him, you can see it in his art, actually, the fact that he paints normal Glaswegians. It's part of his whole aesthetic. But I thought that his voice, the fact that his voice was so unique, was indicative of his mind. Yeah. Because obviously the things that people say and how they say them were indicative of, to some degree, their thought processes. And there was absolutely nobody else that I've ever met who spoke like him or acted like him in person. He was a unique presence in person. He wasn't just generic Scottish writer, you know, like me. Alasdair Gray will be a presence in the Scottish literary landscape in the same way that Robert Burns is still a presence in the Scottish literary landscape. We're going to be talking about him for hundreds of years. You know, he's as seminal as Walter Scott and people like that, you know, James Hogg, like the all-time greats, Lewis Grassic Gibbon, you know, Lanark. I mean, not just Lanark, Poor Things, for example. 1982 Janine. I think we're going to be talking about these books for as long as people are talking about Scottish literature.
I am not a man. I am an instrument. I am the instrument of a firm which installs instruments to protect the instruments of firms which produce meat, cloth, machines and whiskey, which are instruments to feed, dress, move and stupefy us. But the National installs most of its instruments around nuclear reactors, instruments powering the instruments which light, heat and entertain us, and banks, instruments to protect and increase the profits of the instrument owners, and military depots where the weapons are kept which protect the nation's instruments and profits from the protective instruments of the Russian instrument makers. Mirrors reflecting mirrors are the whole show? No. Instruments serving instruments are the whole show.
1982 Janine is also fantastic and was Gray's own favourite, or at least he said it was. I think part of that was about trying to steer people away from Lanark a little bit, just because Lanark came to dominate his work so much that there was so much else that was there that didn't get a huge amount of attention in his lifetime. From 1981 onwards, Lanark just grew and grew and grew in terms of its reputation. And because it contributed to change in the cultural landscape in Scotland and became this key touchstone, almost everything else got missed. Only 3 years after Lanark, he published 1982 Janine, which was this highly political, super experimental, genuinely radical novel, which was stream of consciousness in places, about a Tory alcoholic holed up in a grim hotel, which was, you know, absolutely ripped apart Thatcherism, and there are all sorts of wonderful things in it. That's a great book too, and the way it experiments with how to present text on the page, how the mental breakdown of the protagonist is dealt with, all of that's wonderful. But it's a bit more hard work than Poor Things.
I think people couldn't understand why he was doing both, why he was writing and painting at the same time. For him, it was all part of the same world building. It was richer as a result of that, because I guess there's people who can maybe get more from looking at a picture than they could from reading a passage. And I think there's a real equity of experience within that, creating multiple ways in which people can interface in a way with that world building.
And his art, I think, just captures people in a very honest way. Like, I think it was in Poor Things when he kind of spoke about that, like, people don't talk about women's bellies enough. You know, like, they sexualise the bums and the boobs, but, like, they don't sexualise the bellies, and they should. And sort of he'd always draw women and he'd show, like, the sort of curves in their bodies, like, on their bellies, their belly rolls. And I just think it's kind of, he kind of saw the beauty in things that other people weren't kind of willing to capture.
Well, there's a really symbiotic relationship between the art and the literature. It's actually sometimes difficult to separate them, not least the fact that he designed his own books. So the first time I ever heard of Alasdair Gray, I was maybe 17, and I had an illustrated encyclopedia of science fiction. And there was a chapter on canonical sci-fi works, novels. And you've got Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov, you know, people like H.G. Wells, right? And there was a whole page devoted to Lanark. And I had the cover really reproduced in quite some scale. And I looked at it and I was like, that does not look like the cover for a sci-fi novel. That does not have the title that you would expect for a sci-fi novel, Lanark. That's a place just up the road. Why would you call a sci-fi novel Lanark? It's like calling a sci-fi novel Kirkcaldy or Brecon. When I was doing my postgraduate doctorate, there was another student who was really fanatical about Alasdair Gray, and he was teaching an undergraduate course on it, and he would be like that all the time about Alasdair Gray. Now, at that time I was starting to publish short stories. I think I was working on my first novel, and he's like, "You're a Scottish writer, why have you not read Alasdair Gray?" And I was like, "I read it in Lanark." "Aye, you've got to read Lanark." I said, "Aye, I've heard of that. He's got his art on the walls." "Aye, that's him. He's an amazing Scottish artist. You've got to read him." And I was like, "Right, let's do this." And I sat down and read Lanark. And obviously, you know, like, that. Well, that's that.
You could obviously set out examples of artworks like Òran. It's the most kind of immersive, his largest mural artwork within the West End of Glasgow. You could talk about sort of Lanark. You could talk about, I guess, key seminal works. For me, in many ways, it's kind of the city, it's Glasgow. The way in which he sort of reimagined it and fixed it in key points now and for the future. And I feel passionate about the city in a way, taking ownership of that and starting to sort of celebrate that more, because, you know, it's a continuum beyond Alasdair. There's many other creatives who are using and exploring the city in that way.
We could certainly have another Alasdair Gray, or somebody who's inspired by Alasdair Gray in some way, or who makes their mark in some fresh way that is somehow rooted in or aware of previous contributions to culture. In a sense, that's what writers always do, because we read other writers. In order to produce things of our own, we learn from what others have done before us. So who knows what will come? I'm pretty positive about the future.
And in the meantime, should people read more Alasdair Gray?
Oh yeah, but they should read things that aren't Lanark. Like, Lanark is wonderful, but it's not everything. Alasdair's short stories in particular are absolute glories. The novel The Fall of Kelvin Walker, about a young Scot going to London and his rise and fall, is wonderful. 1982 Janine is absolute filth, but it's brilliant. Poor Things is brilliant fun, and it's rooted in Glasgow in this kind of unique way. There's loads and loads of great work. His non-fiction, his book of prefaces, and also his life in pictures. So he wrote an autopictography, believing that nobody else would ever be interested in his art, and that is already out of date. So there's so much work of Alasdair's that's worth discovering.
Do you think it's a shame in the sense that it took, you know, a Greek director and an American film studio to adapt what was a quintessentially Scottish Glaswegian story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, you know, Alasdair met Yorgos and he kind of approved that whole process. And I think what Lanthimos is doing is an interpretation, his own interpretation of Poor Things. And I think Alasdair did approve and would wholly approve of that. Is there an argument still for that film to be rooted back into Glasgow and to be made in Glasgow and in Scotland? Absolutely. But, you know, there's been new interpretations of Dickens made, that they've been transplanted beyond London, and similarly you can think about that with maybe Joyce or other, like Dante is a good example of that too. So I think, of course, for it to prove that it is universal, you need to have other perspectives and other people coming in and rooting it and taking it beyond the local. But I still think there's an argument to be made of making a version that is local.
There's loads of things that make Poor Things, in my view, the best Alasdair Gray novel. First of all, it's the most fun. Gray was always playful, even in Lanark, which is of course heavy in lots of ways. There's a lot of playfulness there, say for example in the Index of Plagiarisms or in the humour that's present. But in Poor Things, that is much more dominant. It's really playful, even the way the book is laid out with the illustrations and the portraits of the key characters. And partially that's because it started out as a short story and then just grew really fast and grew in this fun, exploratory way. So he never sat down to write this big book. It was intentionally this tiny story at the beginning, and then it just sort of flowered in this organic way. And so the way that it reads is a lot more freeing, I think. Also the fact that it's based on an existing story, as many of Gray's best are, and this is like a Glaswegian Victorian Frankenstein. The fact that it's a creative response to that, I think because he knew that story so well, once he had a clear sense of how he was going to map Glasgow onto Frankenstein, then it just all came out in a rush. And I feel like you can really get a sense of that on the page. It's really dialogue heavy, really, really accessible. It's very, very funny. But because Gray was an expert in Victorian literature, it sort of plays with a lot of tropes that are familiar from the best known Victorian books and from Scottish Victorian literature as well. So it's just an accessible, fun story on the surface that is also a really interrogative, smart exploration of national identity, sexual politics, all at the same time, while also having this Gray trick that you see across his other books, but that I think is most effective in Poor Things, which is you often get multiple voices and none of them is an objective truth. You read a voice, you think you know where something is going. You read another voice, you begin to doubt the first one, and again, and again, and again. So all of those things together, I think, make for Alasdair Gray's best novel.
I mean, Poor Things is among his very best, which I think is evidenced by the fact that it might possibly be, I've not got the stats for this, but it might be his biggest selling book internationally, because it won 2 major literary awards. It sold quite well in America, as far as I'm aware, which is possibly how Yorgos Lanthimos has come across it. It's also his most accessible book, I think. You know, it's drawing upon genres that people are familiar with. You know, there's elements of sci-fi in there, the historical novel, Victorian novel, Gothic novels, and it's a lot of fun.
And actually, at the time it was published, Poor Things was the big hit. Lanark, never made even the long list for the Booker in the early 80s. It was extremely rare that any Scottish novel of any kind would be taken seriously in England, and Gray certainly fell foul of that. But Lanark's reputation grew over time and came to dominate everything. But it was kind of ignored outside a fairly narrow part of Scotland initially. While Poor Things won the Whitbread Book Award, it won the Guardian Book Award, there was a US tour that Alasdair went on. Alasdair Gray on US tour, It was genuinely a breakout hit, and loads of people were reading it in England. I remember there was one of the portraits from Poor Things was on the front of the London Review of Books, one of Alasdair's illustrations, and that was just completely unheard of. So that was a big commercial hit at the time, but that's been forgotten a little bit since, because Lanark has become this behemoth that just sort of eaten everything. So I'm genuinely interested to see how Lanthimos' film has an impact on whether that changes things in any way.
I mean, would you agree that the Glaswegianness is a really important aspect of the book?
Absolutely core, yeah. And that's not going to be in the film. So, my guess is that that's going to upset a lot of people. My feeling is that Alasdair, who spent his entire working life declaring the influence of other writers and rewriting stories in new ways and putting them in Scottish contexts, would be quite relaxed about somebody else taking this story and making something new and something of their own about it. I do think a lot of that Scottishness is just going to be lost for this particular audience. But when a story is told and retold and retold and retold, I think ultimately the original benefits from that. So my hope is that people will go with curiosity back to Poor Things and find this glorious Glaswegian novel that is probably going to be absent, at least as far as I can tell from the film. But because it's rooted in Park Circus, and the West End in particular, because of the key marriage scene that happens at the church within walking distance from here. Now, Gray's work was rooted in Glasgow, and he was always pointing to how Glasgow was changing and what was worth recording about the city. And so for anybody coming to the city, if you pick up Poor Things, even in the illustrations and the maps at the back, there are all sorts of things to discover there that are particularly Glaswegian. Yeah, I think so.
It's just, we don't have an industry that's able to support Scottish talent on the screen in the way that we would like. I wish we did. Yeah. I wish we did. As a result of Poor Things being seen internationally, let's even say 1% of the people that see Poor Things across the globe decide to investigate the novel. That's still thousands and thousands of people who maybe read that book and then go, oh, I really enjoyed that, what else has it got? And then maybe read Lanark, and then maybe read 1982 Janine or something Leather, and then go, oh right, so this guy was writing in Scotland in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. Who else was writing? Who were his contemporaries? Oh, James Kelman, oh, Irvine Welsh, oh, Liz Lockhead, oh, Janice Calloway. You know, like, and they start to maybe pull that thread. Now, by no means everybody who sees the movie is going to do that, not even close to the majority. But if even a fraction of them do that, that still puts a focus on Scottish literature that maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. So it swings and roundabouts really. I would like the movie to be more Scottish, but there are also sometimes hidden benefits to it not being Scottish that get it seen more. And that can have knock-on effects for maybe Alasdair Gray's legacy.
Well, when I was starting to do my biography about Alasdair, so that was written between 2005 and 2008. And around that time, Alasdair had several scripts that he wanted to get off the ground himself. He was, and he would have said this himself, a bit of a control freak about his own stories when he was alive and able to influence things. He did a storyboard for a film of Lanark, which never came to be yet, who knows, in the future. And he did a script for Poor Things. There was a Scottish independent company that initially was interested in making the film. And around the time that I was writing my book, over a period of about 2 or 2.5 years, there were always rumblings about whether this thing would happen or not. I remember very clearly that it was talked about for a period of about a year. Oh yes, Robert Carlyle is on board. It's just not too long after he'd come through as a major Scottish actor of his generation. That Helena Bonham Carter might be down for Bella or something like that, which I thought would be great. But there are all sorts of rumours, and options on that film were picked up again and again, but for peanuts, I think. And I'm not sure how close they were to ever actually making production happen in Glasgow. And I think I would still like to think that that kind of thing would be possible in the future. I'm not an expert in the film industry, so I don't know exactly what the reasons are why it doesn't appear to be possible for Scottish literary stories to be told on film or to be adapted. I can think of a handful of fantastic examples, breakthroughs over the years, over the last 3 decades maybe, but it does appear to be a rarity. The reason why the Lanthimos film has gone ahead is because Alasdair was asked and went round to Bernard McClaverty's house. Bernard McClaverty, the great Northern Irish writer who's been based in Glasgow since the 1970s. He was Alasdair's chess partner for years, and he egged Alasdair on as he was writing Poor Things. Alasdair would go around to Bernard's house. They would play chess. Alasdair would read him a few pages of Poor Things that he'd written that week, falling about laughing, doing all the voices. Bernard would egg him on, send him away, and he'd come back with more of the story. So Bernard was always particularly closely connected to the development of Poor Things. And Alasdair brought round a DVD of a previous Yorgos Lanthimos film and said, do you have anything to play this on? Because he didn't have a TV. And they watched an early Lanthimos film, and Bernard said, you let this man do whatever he wants. He's an artist.
I think Lanthimos and Alasdair Gray are very like-minded. So that's exciting. And then you look at the cast. So you've got Emma Stone, you've got Mark Ruffalo, you've got Willem Dafoe. You know, these are people that the general audience knows and are much more likely to watch it as a result. If we're being realistic, you know, a lot of people out there will watch a film depending on know who's directed it, who's in it. That's just the reality. So you've got a stellar cast there. And it's also the sort of film that I can imagine, if they've done it right, there's going to be Oscar buzz about eventually. So the fact that an Alasdair Gray adaptation could be in contention for an Oscar this time next year is immensely exciting.
I do feel a sense that something that matters is lost if the only version of Poor Things that people get to see erases Glasgow. But I believe that it's likely that if the film is a success, then that may open doors for future versions or for other stories of Alasdair's to be told in the future. So that there is a broader issue of how does Scottish culture ensure that its stories are told without those stories just being picked up by people from somewhere else and having the Glasgow erased. But I am very glass half full.
Park Circus in the West End of Glasgow is the most important location in Poor Things. It's the planet that the whole story revolves around. It's the home of Godwin Baxter, played by Willem Dafoe in the film.
Given the importance of Glasgow and Scotland to all of Alasdair Gray's work, I can't help but be a wee bit upset about the lack of that presence in the Lanthimos adaptation. It would be like Joyce with no Dublin, or Dickens with no London. But it's unfair to be angry at Lanthimos. We should direct our frustrations at our own culture here in Scotland. Why did it take a Greek film director to tell this uniquely Glaswegian story? Why are we so afraid of telling our own stories? Is it a Scottish cultural cringe? Is it the lack of Scotland's independence? Or are our creative industries just absolutely skint? Whatever the answer to those questions is, Scotland now has a rapidly growing film industry, and that's something to be excited about. The only thing is, more often than not, we're just a pretty backdrop or a stand-in for somewhere else. Meanwhile, countries like South Korea, Denmark and Ireland are creating cinema that investigates and celebrates their own cultures. And Scotland needs to do the same. We need cinema that is specific to Scotland, but through that finds universal appeal. And our country is barely ready for the conversation. Scotland's greatest ever 20th century author is about to get his first film adaptation, and Scottish media barely seems aware. The Lanthimos adaptation seems to be missing Glasgow and Scotland, and that's a shame. But it does seem to celebrate Alasdair through its production design, and Willem Dafoe shows shades of Alasdair himself in his performance.
Her brain and her body are not quite synchronised, but she's progressing at an accelerated pace.
When Alasdair Gray penned Poor Things, he put it out into the world to be interacted with, and Yorgos and his cast will have done so brilliantly. It would have been nice to see this filmed and directed in Scotland, but at least Lanthimos has added to Alasdair's legacy. Millions of people are going to see this film, and some of them are going to buy the book and discover the beautiful mind of Alasdair Gray.
You know, it was one of the most transformative relationships in my life. It massively impacted who I was personally and professionally, and I can see the transformative power his legacy and his work can have for others. The legacy is that. The legacy is not just the work and how you reimagined the city, but how we can be better and do better by thinking about others, by working collectively, you know, by having kind of equity at the core of what we do. So it's the politics that's infused within all of that too, which I think is what we've been trying to fix within the organisation. You know, it's not just about preserving the work, it's about preserving the ethics of how you made the work too. What a rich legacy that it feels like it's endless, the potential for for learning or new things being added to it too. And that's partly about his generosity, because he gave so much away to other people that, you know, I most weeks get an email from someone saying, I met Alasdair in this pub or at this festival and whenever, and he gave me this, or we had a conversation about that. That, you know, tying into what we talked about earlier, really valuing people and taking time to get to know people, and I think that comes through, and what a rich legacy to feel like so many lives have been touched by what you've made and what you've left behind.
Democratisation, by which I mean everything that he made, he chose who went in the frame and who got cut out of the frame, who was at the front, who was at the back, how they were presented. And often he chose to juxtapose ordinary Glaswegians that would otherwise not make it into the picture, whatever the picture was. Glaswegian buildings that were about to be knocked down or disappeared, places that would usually get no attention, and they became the centre of his work. That's what I loved about his work, and that he would usually set that within some kind of magical or supernatural or impossible or biblical setting. You know, you see that here in the Òran Moor. You've got Adam and Eve of different races, naked, embracing, looking up at the sky. There's Mother Nature there, and just to the right, there's Kelvin Bridge. And on the right, on the other side, there's a mirror of the cleaners of the Òran Moor from 2008, and a mirror of the workers that built, you know, that were working on building the place in 2004. You know, that to me is what Alasdair Gray stood for.
His incredible experimentalism, his humanity, his generosity of spirit, his humour. He's just one of the great titanic Scottish figures in the way that Charles Rennie Mackintosh is, for example. You know, people still identify a certain style with him and always will. So the fact that I managed to live in the same city as him for any number of years and encountered him sometimes, I will see as one of the great privileges of my life. I think we all will.
When I set out to make this documentary, I wanted to answer my own questions, but Alasdair has just kind of given me new ones. I hope then that we've at least made a tribute befitting one of the greatest Glaswegians to have ever lived. We may no longer have Alasdair Gray, but his legacy will continue to loom over this city and shape Scotland for as long as it has a culture.
I started making maps when I was small. Showing place, resources, where the enemy and where love lay. I did not know that time had to lie.
I think it was like the thing that he found beautiful, you know, even if it was disappointing sometimes, like the way Van Gogh would always paint sunflowers like Glasgow was Gray's sunflowers.
Events move continually down, erasing landmarks, erasing the levels like snow. I did not know that time adds to land. Time adds to land. Time adds to land.
You can't read him without being changed. Alasdair Gray's work has had an influence in virtually every Scottish writer that's come after him.
I have grown up. My maps are out of date. The land lies over me now. I cannot move. over me now, I cannot move. The land lies over me now, I cannot move. It's time to go. I did not know the time had to land. Time had to land. Time had to land.
Having a connection to Alasdair and being able to make some kind of small positive contribution to sharing his work, what it means, its value with other people, is, without exaggeration, a key way that I cope with being alive. It helps me make sense of the city around me, why I'm in this place, what I'm for as a writer and as a person. I feel like it's one of the few things on planet Earth I can talk about with some authority. and Alasdair enriched my life in a huge way. Knowing him utterly transformed my life. When I started out, I only imagined writing fiction. I didn't think I would be able to write about the real world in any way, and I couldn't imagine how I would do it. And since then, I've largely made a living out of writing about the lives of others. And I've been more comfortable doing that, actually. I feel like I'm better at that. And it's given me a lot of joy. And even since Alasdair died, or even especially since Alasdair died, I reflect on that a lot more. And I've continued to write about him. I think if I was doing it all the time, it would drive me mad and would drive everybody else mad, but I just do it occasionally. So, for example, my next book, which is out next year, which is called Joshua in the Sky, which is a mixture of autobiography and biography of my nephew. And there is a large essay in there, a large chapter of the book called On Biography, which is about standing in this space in Òran with Alasdair, watching films about his life and reflecting on what I'd learned many years later from, as a young man, writing about Alasdair, and then what that had taught me about how we look at each other, how we treat each other, and how we make sense of a life. Because he had this outsized personality that meant that often people could only really see what they felt were eccentricities, almost to laugh at. And yet he was adored and admired as well. And there was something I was always a little bit suspicious of about that, even though he played up to it sometimes and he knew he was doing it. But he said again and again that he really just wanted people to look at the work. So that forced me to think a lot about, well, how much is the person part of the work? What is legitimate to say about that person? And once that person is gone, how do you then remember them to others? And I don't think that's something that you ever come to a point of getting right, but it's worth thinking about.